Welcome to episode 64 of the Food Grads podcast, a podcast where we explore careers in the food, beverage, and agricultural industries. I'm your host, Veronica Hislop, a PhD candidate in molecular science and career partner with Food Grads. This week on the podcast, I interviewed Abbey Thiel, researcher at Wageningen University and Research. She is also a food science communicator as Abbey the Food Scientist. She shares fun tidbits about food, explains the science behind some of your most beloved dishes, and dives into what a food scientist does. In this episode, Abbey and I talked about food science in the academic world. We started by covering what exactly a postdoctorate researcher does, and why Abbey decided to pursue this path after completing her PhD, and why she decided to pursue a PhD in the first place. We talked about the graduate experience and all the questions that comes with it, such as working with academic supervisors, how she dealt with the struggles of experiments which don't go as planned, and how PhD is not your entire life. We also rounded the episode by talking about Abbey's co-authored book, Careers in Food Science, From Undergraduate to Professional, and we dive into how that came to be. It's obvious that Abbey loves food science, and it really comes through in this episode. So if you're a student looking to learn more about the academia side of food science, then this is the episode for you. Well, enough with that introduction. Let's get on with the show. Thank you so much, Abbey, for taking time to come on the show. I've been seeing you all over, it's kind of crazy. It's been I swear 2 years since I've seen you starting posting stuff on LinkedIn and all those things. And I'm like, she's a pretty cool person. But I kept scrolling, which I know is not good. And then I was finally like, no, I need to get her on the show because with your the book that came out and all that, and we'll get into it today. So regardless, thank you for coming on the show, Abbey.
I'm very excited to be here, and I have also been following your podcast, so I think we I've been doing the same thing, but never contacted each other.
It's like that parasocial relationship where you're like, I'm consuming their content. They're cool. I think I know them, but you've never spoken to them.
No, it's like, we would be best friends if we knew each other, but we've never talked.
Well, that's the strange thing about today. It'll be like there's some podcasts I follow for years, and I'm like, I know this person really well, and then I was like, they have never seen me in my entire life.
Yes.
Anyways, we're gonna change that today. We're gonna have a conversation, and the audience can have a parasocial relationship with us.
That's true.
So thanks, Abbey, for coming on the show. And to get us started, I wanted to talk about, there's a lot of different directions I could take us on, but I think I wanted to talk mostly or get you started with talking about postdocs and such. So maybe you can start us off by telling us what a postdoc does, what you research, and then we'll kind of take that career journey to how you got there.
Yes, absolutely. So right now I'm a postdoctoral researcher, and I kind of think of it as I'm no longer a PhD student, but I'm not a professor yet. I haven't landed a assistant professor job. So it's kind of like this middle ground. You're not a student anymore because I do have my PhD, but it's sort of like I'm doing more training to one day hopefully become a professor. So it's kind of like getting more experience.
Okay. See, that's something that I didn't ever even, when I was an undergrad, I didn't even know postdocs were a thing. It was PhD or nothing.
Yes. So after my PhD, I really loved teaching and doing research. And so really the next step was becoming a postdoc. And this also was a great opportunity to go abroad. So I spent 6 months of my PhD abroad in Australia and had the best experience. So after my PhD, I knew I wanted to go somewhere new, a new university. And really, a postdoc is an easy job to relocate because universities are, always looking for good researchers, especially if they're willing to move, which is how I ended up moving from Wisconsin in the US. Now I'm in Wageningen in the Netherlands.
I never thought about that with the postdoc in terms of just the ability to move around, because it's actually a strange thing if someone stays in the same location if they're doing their postdoc. So that's a good way to explore the world. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And I think the reverse is seen in industry. My friends who are in industry, it's really hard to get a job in other countries because the companies don't want to pay for all the visas
Hmm.
and all of that stuff. Where in academia, it's seen as like a great strength if your team is more diverse. Like they are willing to pay to my flight
Hmm.
to move to the Netherlands.
So tell me, how did you decide to choose the Netherlands as a location to continue your post or to do a postdoc?
Yeah, so I made basically, I think I had 3 top universities that were, like, all around the world. To me, these are the 3 best universities, and I don't know how it happened, uh, and Wageningen was on the list, and I saw an ad. I think I first saw it on LinkedIn, like, a job posting for a postdoc at Wageningen University in the dairy group, and I was doing dairy research, and it was at, like, the exact right time for me. It just was, like, everything aligned. So I knew, like, these potential universities, and it just matched up in the end.
That is, it doesn't surprise me hearing about that university, which I don't want to butcher the name as
Mhm.
I say this, but they're
Yes.
very well known for food science. Like I actually have a few postdocs who have been from that Wageningen. Oh my gosh.
I can say it, Wageningen.
There you go. I say we just call them the people from the Netherlands. That's usually how I do it.
Yes, Dutch people, yep,
Yeah,
yep.
so we actually have a few postdocs that have come from there, and it's just
Mhm.
that seems like a food science paradise for someone looking to really dive into that research.
Yes, when I sent in my resume, like my CV, there's I'd be lucky if I get an interview. Like I did not have high hopes that I would be the one picked for this job because like you said, I was like, it's gonna be competitive. Like
Mhm.
I know that absolutely because it you in the States, they have such a good reputation. And it's, on a different continent.
Yeah, exactly. So with the research that so we've talked about you are doing a postdoc and we've kind of like jumped around from the topic at hand, which is the idea of focusing on research. So because you're our first guest who is more focused in that
Mhm.
academia role, I'd love to talk about just what PhD is, what postdoc is. So maybe could we talk like bring it back to your undergrad and say, how did you
Mm.
make that decision to do a PhD? And then how did you decide this particular topic to focus on?
Yes. So I feel like it was a bit of a unique scenario. So I knew I was going to start like my master's and my PhD actually my senior year of undergrad, like my 4th year of my bachelor's degree, because one of the professors had a USDA grant funded. Like he got a call on the phone and they're like, "Hey, you got the grant." And like 15 minutes after he got that call, I walked in to have a meeting with him, and I think this gave him the idea like, "Hey, you know who, like, a great master's and PhD student would be? It'd be Abby." And so he kinda, like, pitched it to me being like, if you're thinking about going to graduate school, I have this opening, and if you want it, I want you to take it." And so I knew like a full year ahead of time that I would be continuing my studies when most of my friends went into industry.
That is amazing. That is so cool. Like
So, yes.
I've also kind of come to realize that being in my own lab environment that sometimes it's just the right time at the right moment. Like, it goes to also show too when you're being an undergraduate, like getting involved in your local
Mm,
university labs and just being involved because someone might think of you and it's just to be honest, for a lot of professors, it's a lot easier to just take someone they know that's been at the school than, trying to find a new master's tour and all that. But sometimes it's just coincidence and you walk in at the right time.
no, absolutely. And it's funny because this professor, met me when I was a freshman. I was like
Really?
18 years old, so I had known him for 4 years. So like you said, it's less of a risk because they see you grow through the food science program. And but that being said, I just want to point out when I accepted that PhD role, I had no idea what I was doing or where I was going.
I think that I know with my personal experience, I did undergraduate research with the current professor that I'm with.
Mm,
And then I was like, do I really want to do a graduate? Like, do I want to go to master's degree? And I was like, I'm not sure. If I'm not sure, I'm not going to sign up. I'll go work in industry.
mhm,
And that way, if I have
mhm,
a year or two or whatever, I can always come back. And well, sure enough, after a year, I was like, yeah, I want to come back for research. And it was just like, I emailed him. I said, "Hey, I'd like to continue on research. Is there any projects available?" Very polite, professional. And then he's like,
mhm.
"Yes, I'm ready. Let's talk." And it's like, "Wow, okay, it's done." And I was like, "I have no clue what I'm doing." Because I didn't have a
Yeah.
food science degree. I had a chemistry degree. And of course, that's very complementary to food science. But coming into a research lab and doing proper research, I didn't know what I was doing for a long time. And sometimes I question if I
Mhm.
still don't.
Yes, yes. I feel like, now I'm several years out of my PhD. And I think when students see me, like when I'm teaching and I'm very passionate about what I do, and they'll ask me, like, how did you know this is what you're supposed to do? Like, how did you get here? But like, I did not have a plan, especially when I accepted going to graduate school. It just was like, well, I'm really good at school. And I've done school like since I was 5 until now. So I don't really know what to do if I don't do school.
It's a really good point. And one thing that I've also learned with this experience is the professors don't actually like if you're going to the master's program, maybe you're going from undergrad and then you're entering in a different PhD lab, that might be different, but they understand that you don't have that foundational knowledge in the
Mhm,
first few months or even year of your PhD is just really learning in depth the like going really deep into a topic that you never even knew could go this deep.
mhm. Yes, I know my advisor for, like, the first couple months, all he wanted you to do was, like, get used to if you moved the new city, the lab, the equipment, and I was kinda confused. I was like, "Why isn't he giving me, like, something specific to do?" But it's like it's a big transition. It's not like undergrad.
No, not at all. So tell me, can you tell a little bit about the research that you did at the time? You did mention that you studied, pardon me, dairy science, but as you know, once you get into PhD, it gets very, very specific. So, what
Yeah.
particular area did you study?
Yes. So I actually looked at ice cream, but specifically the microstructure. And I was looking at what are the fat globules doing? Because ideally, you want them sort of coming together and forming these big clumps or networks. Because if you have that, you get a very different texture or a very different meltdown than if the fat globules don't do that. So I did study ice cream for my PhD, but more specifically like fat in ice cream.
That is so cool, and as we were talking prior to this conversation, for those who might know me, I study, water and oil emulsions stabilized by fat
Mhm.
crystals, so even though I can say they both have fat in the title, they're cousins to each other, but they're
Yes.
so different, like, you would it's amazing. This is, like, one of the things I've loved about PhD is you just don't realize how in depth you can get about a topic that you just never really get to in school. And it's just really exciting and fun.
Yes, or you realize, like, what you were taught was actually, like, what we think is happening, but we're not so sure certain yet.
Yes. That was a huge transition for me. I know with,
Mhm,
high school, they might simplify, like, the board diagram or something like that, but when I
mhm.
came and stepped into, like, trying to explain to my grandmother what I do, I was like, "Okay, you know the textbooks? Well, I try to help figure out what goes in."
Oh, yes, yes.
Well, that's really cool. And, with your PhD, did you, so the first few months you were learning about it, getting into the equipment. How, how did it actually work the PhD in terms of figuring out what experiments you're going to do? Was that something that your professor, your supervisor gave you, or was it something that you had to come up with on your own?
So I think it depends on what year of my PhD I was in. So when I started, absolutely, I talked with my professor and we planned out the general experiments. Like, ideally, these are the experiments we would want to turn into a paper. usually the ideal never works, but absolutely I was like still had a lot of support from him. But then as, the years go on, I became more and more independent where like I would come up with the idea, lay it out, and maybe just at some point try to run it past him. But that being said, I had an advisor that was very, very, very hands off, was his style. Like he expected the students to be independent and to solve their own problems. So it's very different here now that I'm at Wageningen. Most of the PhD students here have a weekly meeting with their supervisor, like a weekly planned meeting. That was not my experience. I had maybe the opposite experience of that. So it really depends.
That well, I'm kind of in the middle with you. So I do have my weekly, well, bi-weekly, it depends on the semester.
Mhm.
And it's very, we get in, we talk about it, but it's very he's very hands off. Because
Mhm.
he wants us to, experience it. And he's a very busy person. I don't know how professors manage to do all that they do. It's insane. But
Yes. Yeah.
it's nice that you've been able to see both the changes and is that so with postdoc, is that a very similar? Do you also still continue to create your own experiments? Is it more hands-on, hands-off?
Yes, so I do both. And I would say it depends on the postdoc, but at my position, I can create do my own research, but I also supervise bachelor students doing a research thesis, master's students, and I co-supervise one PhD. So it's a really good mix right now for me.
Wow. And did you ever think that you would be doing something like this when you were doing your PhD?
Oh, no, I could not see the end when I was in my PhD, I was like, "Maybe this will never stop. Maybe this is the rest of my life."
It's so funny you say that 'cause that's how I feel right now.
Yeah, yeah. No, I couldn't envision a time when, like, that was not my life, even when I was near the end. Yeah.
I thought this was just me. It's so funny because I was having a
No.
conversation with like a family member, and the people always ask you like, "Well, how long before you graduate? What are you going to do after you graduate?" And I'm like, I can't even imagine what I'm doing like next year. That's not this. So I have no answers for you.
Yes. And I would just like to make an announcement. Never ask a PhD student when they're going to graduate. That is the worst question to ask a PhD student. And so many people ask it, like everyone. And it's just like a slap in the face because you're working so hard, but you're like, I don't know.
Oh my gosh, yes, I tell people that when they ask me the question, I'm like, that's one of the questions you're not supposed to ask a PhD
Yes, yes,
because it always
yes.
you'll say 2 years and then it'll be a year later and you're like, still 2 years. Because it's so like
Oh, yes.
science is so messy and
Hmm.
you put out an experiment, it seems very viable on paper, like why wouldn't it go the way it does? And
Hmm.
then you go do the experiment and it doesn't work out. So then you have to realign. And, I've learned you start your PhD, you say, I'm going to maybe do these 3 papers. And then it doesn't go that way. And sometimes that's not a bad thing because a topic gets really, really interesting and you kind of go over in that direction. But you got it. Don't ask a PhD when they're going to finish.
Yes. No, no. But I think what you're talking about was also for me a really hard transition is that when you're like in your bachelor's degree, if you're failing or you're acing life, right? You're given like you get an A, B, C, D, whatever. But then you go to graduate school and you try to do research and all of a sudden you're failing all the time. And you're like, what am I doing? I used to be, a straight A student and now everything is terrible. Where after like several years of research, you're just like, well, yep, that's another failure. I'll learn from that.
And how did you learn to manage that? Because that is, I think, a lot of PhD struggle with, and it's hard. Did you have anything that you used to manage that? Because failure is kind of part of the experience.
Yes. Yeah. I wish I had like a very good, helpful answer for you. But I think honestly, throughout my PhD, it just happened more and more that you just are exposed to it. And so it gets easier. The one advice I would say is at first when I failed, I would like make myself work even harder. Like I'd be like, now I gotta be here till 10 p.m. to midnight because this failed. And honestly, by the end of my PhD, I realized the best thing to do was just to like walk away, let it like stop thinking about it. And then later, like a good idea would come to me. Like when I was on a walk, I'd be like, oh, that's the next thing I'm gonna try. But when you are just like
Mhm.
panicked, you can't think it through. So you really should walk away.
That's really good advice, and I'd like to think that maybe as well the PhD stereotype is slowly changing because I feel when I was in my undergraduate, when I thought of a PhD with what limited knowledge I thought, they're always like, "Oh, PhDs are miserable, they're always in the lab, they sleep in the lab,
Mhm.
they don't leave, that's their entire life." They they have no other life besides that, and I do hopefully think that it is shifting now. I know that it's gonna vary on the labs that you go to, but I'd like to think as a whole it's changing.
Yes, and I would add to that, I just learned this a year and a half ago, it really depends on the country too. So, like,
Hmm.
now that I'm in the Netherlands, a PhD is very similar to a 9 to 5 job, they're not sleeping in the lab, they're not emailing their professors at 10 PM, it's a much more balanced lifestyle, where in the US, like, if a professor sees you emailed them at, like, midnight, they're like, "Okay, good, she was working on her project." Like, here, they'd sit you down and be like, "Are you okay?" Like, you
Really?
shouldn't be thinking yes, yeah, so it really can depend where you are in the world.
Huh, that's really interesting because and then
Yes.
again, that also brings up that can go into a whole side tangent about like worker culture, but we're not gonna go into
Yes.
that for this conversation. But it's learning experiences and it's nice to hear that you have that as well. Like I'm happy to know
Yeah.
that you take it when you grow up in a certain country that that's just the norm. Like what you don't even think that it's different. But that's also
Mhm.
one thing I've also enjoyed about doing PhDs. I don't know if it was the case with your current lab or your past lab is just the diversity of people from around the world. I love how with
Yes.
my lab I have people from Brazil, Belgium, the
Mhm.
Netherlands. Like I've just never been exposed to so many people, and it's quite amazing.
No, it's the most fun. I agree. Both the lab I was previously in and here is and you get to, like, celebrate each other's holidays and try their food. It is, like, one of the most fun things about the job.
Yes, and then even though it's sad that you have people leaving your lab, that's like a reason to have a party or a
Yes.
potluck, and then you're constantly trying new cultures and foods, so it's sad, but they're usually fun.
No, no, I know.
So, one of the other things I wanted to bring you on the show and talk about, we've been talking about your postdoc side, but and your
Mm.
PhD side, but one of the main reasons I wanted you here is because of Abbey the food scientist. So, I
Yes.
wanted to know, like, tell us more about Abbey the food scientist. Like, why did you decide, you're a busy person, you're deciding to do some more food science on the side. How did that happen and what is it?
Yes. So this is my YouTube channel, all things food science. Like if I find a fun fact, what I wish I would have known as like a bachelor's student. But the funny thing is, it actually wasn't my idea. It was my boyfriend's idea. And he had to like pitch it to me several times until I actually did anything. but but he is a biochemist and there's a lot of biochemistry in food. And so when we met, and I said I was a food scientist, most people are like, "What?" Like, "Well, what? I didn't know about that." So this was his idea because he's like, "Abby, you have like a very specific specialty that is so interesting, like you have to share it. Like people should know about this." And I agreed, but I was like doing my PhD. I'm like, I can't like we talked about, like I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. How am I going to start a YouTube channel? But what did it is COVID. When we had to go home for COVID is when I finally started it because I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment, and I was supposed to be writing my PhD dissertation, and, like, all of a sudden, I had no friends, like, no family to see, and I was like, "I gotta find something fun to do." I can't write this dissertation all day and night, like, I'm gonna lose it. And so, actually, COVID is what what pushed me to start this food science channel.
Well, the COVID also is what started this podcast, so here we
That's
are.
hilarious.
But, oh, that's, well, props to you for doing that, and I'm really loving the videos that you're putting because as you would know, with food science, there's so much science miscommunication with it.
Mhm.
The phrasing, I understand where a lot of these anxieties come from, very understandable, but, probably you as well, you look at food as a material or
Mhm.
something more than that, so, wow, you've been doing so many I think that it's been great even dispelling different myths about foods, like,
Mhm.
just, like, what a food scientist is and that because, again, I don't
Right.
think a lot of people know about that.
No, I agree. And for me, sometimes these videos are very easy for me to make because I just think, like, what did I want as a bachelor's student? Or what do I wish someone would have told me or I needed to have explained to me? And now I'm kind of like on the other side. And I'm like, I know all this knowledge now. Let me record it for like someone who is still a bachelor's student.
Mhm, and I You know what? You just seem like you're having so much fun with it, and, like, I love that. It's just, like, it's nice to see, more positive science and, like, a little bit of a longer
Mhm.
length of videos as well. Unfortunately, science kind of it's hard to make a very short video, like, on TikTok or something
Mhm.
that is science related without it being incorrect because so much of it has nuance.
Right. No, no, I agree. And no, I am having fun because like you said, this is like my free time. My free time is what when I'm making my videos or writing scripts, but I enjoy, reading like every news article about what's happening in the food industry, what's being launched, and I just use that as inspiration for videos. So it's literally, like what was I interested in this week? That's what I turn into a video next week.
Um So I guess it's just you're just curious in terms because one of the things I've noticed is that you do post besides food science, you also explore the food industry.
Mhm.
Where did that come from when you've really been in school and haven't really, correct me if I'm wrong, been exposed to the food industry? So where did that curiosity or passion come from?
Yeah, I have not been in the food industry for a long time. I had 2 internships during my bachelor's degree many years ago, but I think I just my PhD advisor really let me explore whatever I wanted, even if it maybe wasn't the best use of time. Like he is someone who just believes in like letting people find their passion. And so during my PhD, I just looked into everything until I found stuff that I thought was interesting. And I think I'm also just a person that can find everything interesting, like, if I find the right angle. I'm very much like, if I do something, I will, make the most of it.
Oh, okay. I see. Wow, it's just amazing how big of a role your supervisor has on just your life.
Yes. Yeah. No, honestly, I think so. It's crazy, but you spend so much time working that with that person, years. I started to see like I get the same habits or I approach problems the same way or approach students the same way. It's very weird to realize that.
And so yes, and then that's another, oh my gosh, you are doing so much that I'm like, which direction do I want to take this? But
Yeah.
so right now you've mentioned teaching in that. And I wanted to know,
Mhm.
did you do teaching when you were a PhD?
Yes, I probably did more teaching than I should have because I would sometimes teach, like, kinda be involved with, like, up to 3 classes, like 2 or 3 classes, but
Wow.
I really enjoyed teaching and, uh, it's a really for me, I've found it to be a really good balance with research because teaching, you have, like, instant gratification, like, I can see when I explain something well to a student and they understand it. And you just instantly you're like, "Oh, I did a good job. Like, I taught someone something."
Right.
Whereas research, it's like you're working hard for 2 years, and maybe after 2 years you get a paper, but it's so delayed that you feel good about it.
And when we say about teaching, are you so like at my school personally, I say TAing is like we kind of use it as a blanket term for everything, but that can mean everything from like TAing a lab. So that's where I particularly fall in, or you might do a tutorial. So that's teaching how to do questions. What style did you focus on? Was it like teaching lectures or was it labs?
Yes. So during my PhD, when you first start TAing, you usually teach the labs or the practicals. Like you're in charge of running the students that are doing the laboratories. But then as I like sort of got better and found my confidence, then maybe I was asked to do like a guest lecture. And then, near the very end, then I became like a co-lecturer. So it followed, as I developed and became a better teacher, my responsibilities changed, and then that was actually super useful because the postdoc position I have now is part teaching. And here now I lecture, I will run like week long laboratories. So it was a nice way to start teaching, but it started with very small responsibilities.
Well, that's wonderful. Wow, that's it's really great that you were, weren't thrown to the wolves, so to say. Which it is a big responsibility, I mean,
Hmm.
for sure, and I have to agree because by no means am I doing the same with TAing in the sense of, like, lecturing a class, but there is something really nice about seeing that tangible, working with a student, running a lab, like, each week they get their results back quite and it's right or wrong, unlike the PhD, so it is
Hmm.
as frustrating as it is, sometimes it is nice to have that break from your research just to go back. And it also, I think, gives you an opportunity to really focus in on your own knowledge, like how you
Hmm.
think you know something. And then you realize when you're teaching it, you're like, no, I don't know it as much as I should have.
Yes. No. When you try to teach something, you will realize that you didn't understand it in the first place. Absolutely. And I know for me, one thing I realized from teaching, because I went from doing research full time to helping teach. And research is very isolating. Like I would sit for days at this microscope alone, like listening to my podcasts. And then all of a sudden they're like, "Oh, Abby, you're going to teach." And like I had all these students around me, but I was like, "Whoa, this is really nice. Like someone's talking to me. I'm interacting with people." And usually it was bachelor students. So they're like very excited about their future. Like curious about food science, and I found that it actually kind of was like a pick me up from doing research alone.
Oh, that's so nice. Yes, it is. It can be very isolating. Even if you have a really good lab with like good coffee talks,
Mhm.
sometimes you gotta put
Yeah.
in that hard work and you gotta
Yeah.
sit. Man, again, I'm having like flashbacks to yesterday because I was doing the same thing. Like I'll put on my mic, it is lonely looking at I look at the microscope as well and getting
Mm.
that perfect image and such. And I have my podcast on and I'm like, oh, I really
Mhm.
wish I could just chat to someone while I do this because it's tedious and you have to stay focused because I do find that it's very interesting as well with your work kind of reflects your focus as well. Like if you
Mhm.
have a good
Mhm.
quality image, it's because you're focused. But if you have multiple bad ones, you can usually tell by yourself if it was because you weren't focused or like another reason.
Or you knew you were like in a hurry, like you had to go teach in 15 minutes and you're like, "Well, I got to quick get this done."
Yes.
And then the images are like low quality.
Oh my gosh, yes. I know. I always and then you sit there, you're looking back at your images and you're just like, why did I rush that? You could have just instead of five
Mhm.
bad ones, why didn't you just take one good
Yeah.
one?
No, I know, I know. It's the worst looking back at your data and you're like, "Yeah, I know on that day I had a bad day," and you can tell can tell these pictures are terrible.
So, with their teaching, it's been a good way for you to interact, and I love hearing about that. But one of the things I also wanted to talk about, which relates to what you're doing, is that you co-authored
Yes.
a book. How did that happen? Especially the fact that the topic is not directly food science. It's again that adjacent type of thing. So tell me, how did that happen? And of course, congratulations.
Ah, thank you. No, I was so cool to hold the book. It was very surreal. So it's funny because it's gonna come back to my PhD advisor again. Like we said, I don't know. It's very impactful. So he edited the first version, sorry, of this book. And so that version was like 12 years old by now or something. And he approached me. I had just finished my PhD with him. And he knew I was into writing, into YouTubing, into like outreach about food science as a career, spreading the word. And so he approached me and was like, Abby, I want you to co-edit this book with me. And like, I thought he was a little crazy. That like it wasn't on my radar at all. Like I didn't know this was coming. He kind of like just dropped it on me, be like, hey, we're gonna write this book again. And I was like, oh, because I was like, I don't know how to do that. How does one edit and write a book? But like I said, he kind of walked me through it, and he taught me how to do everything, how to reach out to people, how to work with the publisher. And so it really just was an opportunity again from knowing people, from having a very, supportive PhD supervisor.
That's amazing. And the book I'm quite familiar with because I remember reading the book early on in my I think was it my undergrad or my master's? I definitely have read it multiple times because with a
Yeah.
lot of the work that I did with food grads, that was the only thing that I could actually find that
Yes.
was on the topic. So like to me, I was like, this is an amazing book.
Yes, yeah. Because like I said, like this is one reason I love making YouTube videos is with food science, it's so hard to find like any real direction or advice.
Hmm.
But so now there's this book which basically is like, here's what it's like to major in food science and what you would do with that. Here's, 16 different career paths. Here's a whole section on graduate school. It's kind of like a guidebook. It's not like a
Yes.
textbook.
Exactly, I know. It
Mhm.
unfortunately, it's kind of in that textbooky look, it's in that
Okay, yes, I thought the same thing, and I was like, "People are gonna think this is a textbook."
I know. That's the one thing that, it can be really unfortunate for what's the word? Elsevier I don't know, I'm just thinking of, like, those
Oh,
big
yes, like
publications.
those big publishers, yes, yeah.
Yes. There's another book on food science, it's just called Food Science, and it's one of the really basic ones, but the text it
Mhm.
looks just like a textbook thing, it looks like it's something you're gonna pull off from, like, the 1980s because they never update their title, their
No,
textbook cover. See, oh my gosh, I'm saying
I
textbook,
know.
it's yeah.
Yes.
They all look the same, and it's just, like, it's such a fun topic, and like, the material that you are involved in is so much like, it's so useful, but it's not making its way to, like, chapters or
Right.
the local bookstores, like, shelves, but it's like, this is the stuff that, like, guidance counselors should be giving out because it's really good
Yes.
information.
Yes, I think so. I absolutely agree, and it's a very, like, textbook, like, uninviting cover where I'm like, "No, like, a high schooler should pick this up and just, like, think about what are they gonna do with their life?" Like, it's not a difficult read at all.
Exactly, like, it should be, like, the material that, like, you've edited and as well, um the previous version of the book, it's, I
Mhm.
was like, "Look," that's why I found it by I you know how I remember how I found it? I found it through Google
Yeah.
Books. I looked up, like, food science, and then after if you, like, go to Google Books, and then after I was, like, looking for a preview of it because you can kinda do that, and then I
Yeah.
must have been in university at the time, and I was like, "Oh, this looks like a university book. Oh, okay, now next I'll go
Mhm.
to my university, like, searching thing," but it you gotta maybe that's your next step. You gotta make this a little more, accessible in terms of just, like,
No.
the look of it.
No, I 100% agree. That's one thing I've learned, maybe in teaching, is that it all depends on how you present something. Because you can present the same material in very different ways. Like you can be super boring and bland, or you can make it exciting and make anyone interested in it. And I think that's like what I try to do on my YouTube channel is like, okay, I have learned how to make cheese in my food science classes, but now can I explain it in a way that could engage anyone and teach them?
I love that, I definitely see that for sure because when I think you probably have even seen it. If you go onto YouTube, it might be
Mhm.
changing a little bit, but if you go onto YouTube and then you type in, like, a food science topic, you usually get these very dense, like, lecture videos from like a
Yeah.
professor like writing on a
Mhm.
whiteboard, and the information's great,
Mhm.
don't get me wrong, but then
Yeah.
it's like, okay, this is really dry for like someone who is new to the topic.
Yes. Yeah, and it's like food science is not like that. Like, I would argue food science is the most interesting science, you know?
Right?
It's like chemistry, biology, microbiology, but it's all applied to such interesting products.
And it's so tangible. Like, I mean, at
Mhm.
the end of the day, you tell most people ice cream, like 99% of the people are gonna know what ice cream is. You're gonna tell someone
Yes.
about like LED solar cells, maybe you're talking about the exact same concept in terms of like energy storage, or I don't even know because that gets into food. And they're like, I have no clue
Mhm.
what you're talking about.
No, I agree, and I think even, some people are just like, "Well, I don't like science," and I think food is kind of like a secret way to get them interested in science because everyone can relate to it.
Do you have any like do you now that you were talking about like that, do you have any inspiration for like ways that you're talking about trying to make it more accessible, easier? Um, is there anything that you look to for inspiration for that? Because it is a difficult thing to take something complex and break it down into simpler ways.
Yeah, my favorite thing and what I really always try to do in my classes is sometimes you're supposed to teach something and it's so theoretical and abstract that I always try to think like what food does this apply to? Like could I bring in two products? Like one type of milk is ultra temperature pasteurized, ultra heat temperature or UHT and one is low pasteurization. And I found like just giving the students something, they can hold in their hands, they can taste. It gives them something tangible to hold onto, even if we go into math or equations or something like that.
That's amazing. Oh, I wish I had that for my because I did chemistry
Ah,
and someone
mhm,
like even though
mhm.
the topics like I know like I was curious about them, it just was so untangible for me. Like we're talking about
Yeah,
like metals and like on
yep.
the molecular level, and I'm like, this is really hard to understand, even though it's really cool.
Yes. Yes. No, I know. That's what I when I found food science because I knew I wanted to major in something that was science related, but I was like, how do you know if you pick like chemistry versus biology versus microbiology? And then one of the professors was like, well, like food science is all of them. And I was like, oh, that sounds great.
I know, and that's one thing I remember in, like, my undergrad, I kinda liked phys chem, but I was like, "Phys chem doesn't apply to the
Mhm.
current world," like, because, you're learning about the thermodynamics and the first law, and then coming into the degree now, fats, they melt, they have energy, and now I'm, like, applying looking at the texture of things, and I see that connection, and I'm like, "Oh, this is why we're talking about that." So if a fat melts, it releases energy, and this equates to this, and it's like, "This is so cool."
Yes, so that reminds me for my PhD, I had to do a minor, so I got thrown in these, like, high level chemistry courses that I did not have the prerequisites for, but we had to do, like, a poster session, and, so it's, like, me and my friend who is also a food scientist, a PhD student, and all these chemistry PhDs, and my poster was, like, "Here's the molecules that make up ice cream," and all the chemistry students were like, "What? Really?" And I was like, "Yeah, do you guys see it? Do you see how interesting this is?" But it was kinda mind-blowing for them.
Oh, I know, it's so I love like, I have such an appreciation for food now, like, in a different way. It's just
Mhm.
it's so it puts cooking into a totally different perspective, like, everything, and it's just if you mess up, you're like, "Hmm, did I heat it up too much that it's,
Mm.
I don't know," but you know what I'm getting at.
Yes, or, like, did I store it? Was it supposed to be in the fridge or in the dark? Like, did I store it wrong?
Oh my gosh,
Yes.
yes, don't even get me started with that. Um, so one of the other things that I also wanted to talk about, like coming back to the book. So we've talked about the food industry, but just from your general like being in this topic, like where do you see food science going? On like what is the biggest maybe challenges or opportunities that if a student, like, why should a student go into food science? You know what? Let's break that all out. Why should a student go into food science if they're considering that as a career path?
I think one of the things that is very exciting in the food industry now is I think there's going to be a huge push for like sustainability, which I think when I talk to my students, they all are wondering like, I want to use my degree to do like good in the world. And I think there's going to be a lot of jobs in sustainable packaging, producing foods more sustainable, but balancing that with, well, the world population is still growing and there's still hungry people out there. So I think it's going to be very challenging, but that will make it very interesting for food scientists.
Oh, okay. You're so right. I can't get over how much just in the past 5 years that just the topic of food sustainability and
Hmm.
food is just getting its finally shine. I
Hmm.
feel like maybe before the culture was more about developing foods that are lower calorie, which of course is important, but there was more of a focus on those types of attributes. But as we're seeing, you know, the amount of science that's going into these alternative meats or,
Hmm.
plant-based meats as a whole topic, like depending on how you name it, it's just so exciting to see like all the innovation that's coming now and just imagining I find like for a long time, food wasn't really innovative. I mean, different factories might have created, let's say, ice cream, different flavors of ice cream, but really pushing the boundaries hasn't. It's taken a long time, so it's really seeing a big progression now.
I think a lot of just in the past few years, all like the technological advances in other fields are now being applied to food science. So it's like the technology was there, it just wasn't used.
I think you're right. I just can't get over how much has happened. I'm constantly checking out the news and I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's not futuristic. Like I was hearing about this years ago, but all of a sudden, like now it's happening.
Right. And one of the projects I'm involved now at Wageningen is on animal free milk, like making yeast made milk proteins.
That is so cool.
Yeah, yeah, it's really awesome. Yes.
Oh, I can't wait to, see as your research starts to continue to come
Yeah.
out or just I don't know if you're industry related, but just seeing those types of things because it's, I the landscape of food's changing. It's crazy.
Yes. Yeah. And it's changing quick.
And and for like students who, again, like that's the future with this, like, do you have any advice for because the theme of our podcast episode has been more so focusing on that like PhD master's experience. Do you have any advice that you would give to students who are thinking about considering pursuing a degree?
Yes. I would say so like I said, I had no idea what I was doing when I accepted going to grad school, but if I could go back, I would tell myself think about what you want to do maybe 10 years from now. Like, what job is your ideal job to hold? And then see if that job requires a master's or PhD. Because otherwise, a bachelor's degree in food science is super useful and opens up so many opportunities. Like, decide is it worth giving up a full salary to live on a monthly stipend to get a master's or PhD?
That's really good advice. I think that hopefully with podcasts like this, it also gives a little more information because I do feel it's hard to figure out what is right because so much of it's like on a lab by lab basis or a
Hmm.
university or a country, as you were telling. But I think you're right.
Hmm.
There's a lot. The food industry, to my understanding too, doesn't really, unless you're holding like a very advanced like research, maybe like a high level like plant based research. A lot of them don't need postgraduate degrees. Or sorry, postgraduate is that the right word?
Yes,
Yeah.
no, that's good. Yes. No, no, I agree. That's why I said, like, make sure if your goal requires it, you could get a master's or PhD. But really, a lot of food science jobs you can land with your bachelor's degree, and I think that makes food science very unique.
I agree. Well, I'm going to end the episode there, although I'd love to keep talking about more of these stuff. And I feel like this is just the beginning of something because there's so many
Yes.
experiences I'm realizing as we're talking, like, she knows how I feel. She knows how I feel.
Mhm. Mhm. No.
But I'm gonna end it
I
there.
know.
But I also just before I let you go, I just for all those who are listening, where can people find you?
So if you go to YouTube and search Abbey the Food Scientist, that's my YouTube channel about fun facts. Maybe you're interested in becoming a food scientist. It's a little bit of everything, just depending on what inspired me that week. You can also find me on Twitter at Abbey underscore Thiel. That's Thiel.
Perfect. Well, once again, thank you, Abby, so much for coming on the show. I hope that everyone learned a little bit more about PhD, postdoc, and demystifying that whole area and getting more excited about food science.
Yes, it's been super fun. Thanks for having me.
That was episode 64 of the Food Grads podcast. All the notes to this podcast can be found by clicking on the Student and Grads tab on the Food Grads website. There you can find any notes to past or future episodes on our newly designed podcast page. If you enjoyed this episode, then please head over to wherever you listen to this podcast episode and rate it 5 stars. This helps us get the word out about the podcast and share how great the industry is. Thank you everyone so much for listening. I know you could be listening to anything else right now, but you decided to choose us. So, yay, I am so happy I finally took the time to sit down and talk with Abby after a long time of consuming her content, but not reaching out. I think it's such a small world where her research was adjacent to mine. Her YouTube channel covers so many great topics, from what a food scientist does, to what is food science, to food fraud. She even did some of her own interviews where she interviews food scientists on their careers and their research. Abby is doing such a great job spreading her love of food science in such a fun and engaging way. You can tell that she's very passionate about the topics that she speaks about, and I bet it would be really fun to take one of the courses that she teaches. Not only is food science a powerful tool that can be used to transform our world, it can also just be really fun. So when you're done with this episode, go check out Abby's stuff. We need more eyes on videos helping to dispel misinformation about food science. Also, I apologize for my voice as well as probably my pronunciation of her university. Um, it's a tough one. I'll just say that, and I'm suffering a bit of a cold, so I apologize. Well, anyways, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you everyone so much for listening, and I will see you next time.